So just to introduce myself, I am Professor Nanya Bola-Muller, and I lead a program at the HSRC called the Developmental, Capable and Ethical State. And that is why we have partnered with these organizations that are presenting today, and particularly the Global Initiative. And I want to thank Peter Gastro very much for inviting me to facilitate today. So we're going to be speaking about assessing South Africa's organized crime risk today. And it's based on this very voluminous report. It is really fascinating and quite frightening reading because everything that is happening is underground, in the dark. And so if you're not aware of what's going on, this kind of study really is an eye-opener and makes us realize that the risk is high and the need to address the risk is very high as well. So the first, just to go through the program, the first speaker is Dr. Mark Shaw, and he is I think the main person who is the director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. He will speak for a while because he's got a lot to say. Then we have a panel consisting of Professor Sandy Africa, who is the head of Deputy Dean, Faculty of Humanities and Associate Professor in Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Our second speaker is Ms. Otilia Anna Maunganitsa. Please forgive me, I will always get your surname wrong. Who is Head of Special Projects in the Office of the Executive Director at the Institute for Security Studies. And I see one of my very good friends, Lizette Blancaster, has joined us today as well. I haven't seen you, Lizette, for about 3 years. And then lastly, Advocate Vusi Pokoli, who's very well known to everybody, having been involved in public prosecutions. And he's currently a board member and senior advisor for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, or may I call it GTAC. So I'm also going to be the timekeeper for the session because we do not have enough time. And I will not reintroduce the speakers if you don't mind. I'm just going to hand over to you. But a couple of comments, I think, in this regard. So South Africa is not faring well in the area of organized crime, and I think at least we do know that. But we are ranked 19th out of 193 countries on an index measuring organized crime. 19th out of 193 countries. The trafficking of arms and drugs trade were identified as two areas of great concern. The Global Organized Crime Index was published, or has been published, by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and it provides the first ever assessment of illicit economies in all 193 UN member states, which is quite. Congratulations on that. That really is a feat. The index is the first clear measurement of the scope, scale, and impact of organized crime. It shows the penetration of criminal markets, the risk and impact of organized crime, the dynamics of criminal actors, and the resilience of communities to be able to deal with this. And South Africa, unfortunately, is not very resilient in this regard. In terms of countries in Africa, South Africa ranks 5th out of 54 African countries, and we're number 1 in Southern Africa. This is not good news at all. So the heroin trade is flourishing, if you didn't know that before, and I've already mentioned the arms trade. We're a violent country, and those two things definitely contribute towards the violence that we all experience. When rating resilience, and we're 42nd globally in terms of our resilience against this, we have taken into consideration political, economic, legal, and social measures. So we have an underground. We have terrible things happening in this country. I was just reading this morning about a magistrate who was assassinated in the Western Cape. You know, when our magistrates and our judges are afraid, and then we have a problem. We know about other assassinations that have taken place. We know about the increase in kidnapping that is happening particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. There's a large amount of violence perpetrated against businesses in townships in particular. And all of these disturbing things are going to be unpacked today. And I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Mark. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Nadia, and to you and the HSRC for cooperating with us and providing a platform for the launch of the discussion is very, very kind, and we look forward to partnering with you. To the University of Pretoria, Sandy, also a privilege for us, and to the ISS, really a great privilege to be partnering with old colleagues and institutional partners around the launch of this strategic risk assessment. In the room are many of the people who have also worked on the assessment, and I greet you as well, and I hope you will help contribute and answer questions in and around the discussion after I've presented. Can I just begin by saying that the Global Initiative is a global organization. It has 6 observatories around the world, including an observatory in East and Southern Africa, which Julian Rydermeyer runs. And I think many people in this room follow us, know the publications that we are preparing and putting into the public domain. And our objectives are threefold. Have a real public discussion around issues of illicit economy and organized crime. So we have 60 to 70 publications a year. Bring people together, such as you in this room today, to debate responses to illegal economy and organized crime. And finally, we are supporting around 130 projects around the world, often a community or other actors responding, building resilience to organized crime. And I have to say, I feel that the Global Initiative has a strong South African imprint, because, and people in the audience know that there's a couple of South Africans involved, and of course I am South African too, and we are proud of the South African connection to a global organization. With that, let me begin going through the strategic organized crime risk assessment. And I want to start by taking a long view and then move into the findings of the assessment, draw also a little bit on some of the index data to make some of the points around the conclusions that we've reached. The diagram I'll move over to this side, the diagram or the graph on the screen is South Africa's homicide rate since just after the war, and we should be thankful to Dr. Anin Curricula, who has worked for years on the South Africa's homicide data. But it's important, I think, to make a couple of points. 94, 95, the homicide or murder rate spirals up to over 70 per 100,000, with a rapid reduction, a 50% decline. This is a result of arguably the peace dividend, or not arguably, clearly the peace dividend, as well as the effective implementation of the Firearms Control Act, amongst other things. Then an inflection point around 2011, 2012. Lizette in the audience, I think, is also very familiar with this data. An inflection point, and then an increase. And a 38% increase over a 10-year period, including an upswing in the last several years, and an upswing to 40 per 100,000 or thereabouts. Now, the upswing, the assessment makes that point, the upswing is attributable to a number of things. The growing weakness or institutional weakness of law enforcement, increased vigilante action, but also homicides related to a range of illicit markets. Now, it's very difficult to know what proportion, but I think we can safely say when you look at the illicit markets we present, they are violence generators. And so managing those illicit markets is crucial to managing violence in the country. Violence is not uniform, and if you look at this, this is a 10-year increase across that red period. You can see that KwaZulu-Natal increased in that decade by 68%, the Western Cape by 46%, Gauteng by 42%, Mpumalanga by the same, 42%. And these are some of the provinces with the greatest problems of illicit economy. So the point that I want to start out with is that the discussion we are having here is not at all separate from the overall discussion about violence in our country. And I think that's a key point that we wanted to emphasize. Now, what are the objectives of a risk assessment? First, to understand the growth and impact of illicit markets in South Africa, to understand the harm of illicit markets, to understand how these criminal ecosystems interact, and to stimulate a debate about new responses. Now, the report, which we'll give you afterwards, is very, very detailed, and I'm not going to talk about all of it, so I'll only highlight specific issues that I think are important to our discussion today. What was our methodology? We identified the most critical markets, so we spent some time deciding which markets to look at. Secondly, we did a deep dive into each of those markets, and where we could, in many cases, in fact in most cases, we did on-the-ground original research. We have field workers in different places. We tried to supplement what we could find in the literature with interviews on the ground. And then we looked for connections between the different markets. And we used 50 experts, as I've said, some in the room, over a 12-month process. Now, I think most people in the room would know that the organized crime discussion is full of terminological pitfalls. And we wanted to steer around those, and I'll read quickly the definition that we use. It's slightly broader so that we could cover the 15 markets. Organized crime can be understood as an actor or actors who exhibit organization in terms of hierarchy or connectedness and or strategic sophistication, such as multi-step or complex modus operandis, to achieve an illegal end. When we refer to illicit markets, that's the illicit market for a commodity. I should immediately say that some of the markets, for example, in the transport sector, are not illegal. They are legal markets which have mafia-like activities associated with them. So the terminology mafia-like, we don't say mafia, but mafia-like or mafia-style is imputing a kind of organized crime set of characteristics around geographic control, targeted violence, and hierarchy, etc., etc. I think people are familiar with the definition. Criminal ecosystem is the market plus the criminal actors, the organized criminal actors around them. Protection market for us is not per se extortion. Protection market is corruption to protect the operation of illicit markets. So these are some of the points of terminology that we use not only in our work in South Africa, but globally. Now, how to quantify illicit markets, and this is a huge methodological challenge and one where I think much more work is required, and of course we don't say that we are right on everything, but our objective is to debate the results with audiences like yourselves. First point to make, there's an enormous amount of coverage on illicit activity. If you open the newspaper every day, there are stories, there are multiple academic articles, but there's often no strategic, coherent explanation or conceptual drawing together of the data and presenting it. And that's the objective of the risk assessment here. I say it, and I hope Krista Koch and others don't get upset with me. Crime statistics in this case don't necessarily help very much. The homicide rate is useful, some other data is useful, but crime statistics in their in the plethora of what is available is not necessarily very helpful. And one of the points that we make is we need new sources of data to be able to analyze what we will present to you. And finally, rather obviously, the underworld is hidden, and so you need a multitude of sources, including talking to people in the underworld, and that's our objective. Now, 4 big takeaways from the report. What is the characteristics of organized crime in South Africa? And Nadia has touched on some of these. Firstly, South Africa has a very diverse set of criminal markets. And in all of the countries where we are working, it's really in the top 5% in terms of diversity. DRC, Mexico, Brazil, a lot of resources. These are often middle-income countries, but it's a very diverse set of criminal markets. That makes it much harder to do an assessment and to analyze what we have on the ground. It's facilitated by corruption. It's interlinked to a set of regional markets, and it's extremely violent. And it's the point around violence which I think is critical to highlight, because that's one area where we think interventions can be made. Nadia referred to the Global Organized Crime Index, and I wanted just to present 2 things about South Africa in global comparisons before moving into some of the other findings. This graph is in the report, and basically it's South Africa's criminality, so across 10 markets, measured against South Africa's resilience. And I should immediately say resilience is not only the capacity of the state, it's the capacity of the entire society. So that means the activities of civil society, free press, and others. And the point that comes very strongly through the index is that democracies like South Africa are in fact more resilient to organized crime than authoritarian states for a variety of reasons that I can return to. So we did 2 sweeps of the index under the ENACT project, where we partner with ISS. That's 2019, and 2 years later, after COVID, we did another sweep, and South Africa has moved to the right. So in this period, South Africa's criminal markets increased over the last 3 years. Resilience increased slightly, but this last 3 years has been crucial in the development of illicit markets in our country. What does that mean when we take a snapshot of the data more closely? The red line here is the global average for criminal markets. The red dots are South Africa's position on it. This is a graphic representation. And you can see, with some exceptions, South Africa is well above the global average. On the other side is the line for resilience. The green dots are South Africa. So South Africa looks much better in the area of resilience. So it fits into a set of countries that have high levels of organized crime and comparatively higher levels of resilience. And I think that's an important point to make. However, 2 other points are worth making. Firstly, organized crime erodes that resilience over time. And secondly, it means that the capacity in the state is not being effectively utilized to respond to organized crime. There's a kind of stasis in the system. Now, in terms of what I will present further on in the presentation, this is quite an important slide. In the 2 sweeps of the index, we measured 4 types of criminal actor: state-embedded, actors within the state; criminal networks, mafia style, I've talked about the definition; and foreign actors. And we are now building a database on private sector actors, so it's not yet here. The 2 gray bars are the Africa average and the global average for 2021. The yellow bar is 2021, and the green bar is 2019. South Africa's actor type, criminal actor type, did not change on our assessment, and it's a very long assessment period, in 3 categories: state-embedded, criminal networks, and foreign actors in that period. However, in the mafia-style actor, it changed quite dramatically in that 3-year period. I don't want to explain the methodology, but it's a kind of blind methodology. People wouldn't know that it's increasing, but there's that uptick in violence, the first slide I showed, is associated to the development of mafia-style organizations within the country. Now, having said all of that, let me turn to the 15 illicit markets. We took some time selecting those illicit markets. That doesn't mean we have every illicit market, but we felt that we had the capacity to look in detail at these 15. We divided them into 3. Firstly, selling the illicit, so illicit drugs, illegal firearms, human smuggling and trafficking, wildlife fishing and environmental crimes, category 1. Category 2, dealing in violence, so extortion, including kidnapping for ransom, then kidnapping for ransom or extortion, we have a slight crossover, organized robbery, organized violence, and then the third category is preying on critical services, so that's crimes against critical infrastructure, organized corruption, cybercrime, economic and financial crime, health sector crime, mass public transport, so taxis, buses, etc., and illegal mining. So those are the 15 markets. At a high level, our assessment is very stark, so every market was taken, broken down, we found as much as we could on it. In 10 cases, the red markets, mass public transport, illegal mining, wildlife fishing and the environment, extortion, kidnapping, organized robbery, organized violence, critical infrastructure, cybercrime and economic and financial crime, the markets are increasing over the period in which we analyzed. In 3 cases, but important markets, illegal firearms, illicit drugs, and organized corruption, they are stable at a high level. In 2 cases, they are stable. Human trafficking and smuggling and health sector crime in our assessment, based on all the documentation and material that we had at our disposal. Now, you'll be relieved to know I'm not talking about all of those markets. I'm going to choose a few selectively, but I want to choose markets which fit into 4 categories. First is older markets that sustain and finance mafia-style groups, and they promote law enforcement corruption, and I think this is a very important point that comes through the presentation. Secondly, markets that generate and commercialize violence. The uptick in homicide is the issue of concern. Third, new and emerging infrastructure markets. And finally, protection markets and organized corruption. Now, just to say that in a strategy to respond to organized crime in South Africa, 15 markets may be too much to tackle altogether. But our point is that some markets are more important than others. They have wider sets of linkages and they have a greater set of leverage on the overall criminal economy. We spent some time looking at who the actors were in these 15 markets, and I just want to make some points on those. The actors are not exclusive to the markets. So multiple actors work across markets. The second point is important, is that mafia-style groups, gangs, taxis, etc., the taxi industry, are a source of violence employed by others. So they have wider impact across the market, and there's been a hardening of those groups over time. State-embedded actors are an important source of protection for others. And yes, foreign actors are important, and we have a section on foreign actors, but foreign actors often need to work with local criminal actors to get things done. Foreign actors without local supporters don't survive, with 1 or 2 exceptions. So I'll turn then to cover these markets, beginning with illegal firearms, illicit drugs, extortion, kidnapping, organized violence, critical infrastructure, organized corruption, and cybercrime, to provide some insight into our conclusions. Now, on illegal firearms, many of you know these points, but let me just quickly go through a couple of issues. Organized firearms are now largely from domestic sources, so leakages from licensed civilian firearms and firearms, importantly, under the jurisdiction of the state. Firearms smuggled across the borders are arriving in smaller numbers. The lines have been blurred between legal and illegal sources based on corruption at the Central Firearms Registry and in the private security industry. And access to ammunition is critical to the market. And sources of, once again, the fraudulent use of licenses, private security, and the state. Our view is that firearms are a key driver of violence across all markets. And there's a healthy trade in guns between criminal actors. So there's significant profits to be made in the trade in firearms. And in some cases, people say those profits are as high as in other illegal commodities such as drugs. Firearms sustain the gang and armed robbery economy. And importantly for us, the illicit firearm and drug trade economies, so the ecosystems in each case, have become inextricably linked. You need firearms to defend drug turf, and you need drug turf to buy firearms. So this mixing between two particularly important high-level criminal economies in the context of South Africa. It undermines confidence of citizens in the state, a point I will return to at several points, and firearms have been used in a range of mass shootings, crossing over with some other illicit markets that I'll get to now. Turning to illicit drugs, the South Africa's drug economy is diverse, embedded, and globally embedded. We've done some estimates on consumption. South African drug users are generally poly drug users, so they're using multiple drugs. And the numbers I'm about to give you are for adulterated, so that's mixed, this isn't pure. But on our estimate of speaking to users, South Africa consumes around 146 metric tons of heroin a year, 19 metric tons of cocaine, and 60 metric tons of meth, or otherwise known as TIC. Drug prices have remained comparatively cheap. The street price and the purity of drugs are relatively stable, and supply and distribution chains are stable too, and there's limited law enforcement disruption to the market. South Africa is a geographic nexus of supply linking Afghan heroin. We are doing some work which we think is important down the east coast of Africa on that, and meth, both coming from Afghanistan. Mexican cartel meth traffickers, I think an issue of concern. Colombian cocaine suppliers, Indian and Chinese synthetic drug syndicates, and European organized crime groups. Turning to extortion. For us, extortion is a big issue. Where we are working, for example, in the Western Balkans or Central America, extortion, as it says on the screen, is a textbook organized crime case. It is the provision of criminal governance in spaces where the state is no longer present. In our assessment, extortion is increasing, diversifying and legitimizing itself in South Africa. It's expanded from the nightlife economy, but not only. And there's now large-scale extortion in poor residential areas. There's a link in some places to private security, and there are layers of extortion. Both the formal and the informal sector are impacted by extortion. What are the harms? Violence, fear, and alienation, erosion of trust in the rule of law, and the building of alternative systems of governance. And the evolution of extortion networks almost always is to the delivery of votes in democracies, because it is about geographic control of particular places. I'm not saying that has happened in South Africa, but in our briefings over the last couple of days, several people have also made this point that it may well be underway. And of course, it squeezes small businesses and distorts local economies. So tackling extortion is key. And our numbers and our knowledge of the extortion economy in the country are not necessarily well developed because of challenges of reporting. Turning to kidnapping for ransom, there are different categories, low, mid-level and high. And despite the dismantling through, in fact, the very good work of the Hawks, the dismantling of some syndicates, the market remains active. It drives wider fear and reduces trust. And we make the point that it is crucial for South Africa to not develop a reputation as a kidnapping country, because this is crucial in terms of investment and in tourism, amongst others. And there's a cross-border element, notably to Mozambique. Now, in the next slide, not all kidnappings are reported. That is clear. People resolve them themselves. But turning back to the slide that I began talking about, the homicide rate, kidnapping begins to increase at the same inflection point. 2011, 2012, it picks up to 2019, 2020, and then increases very, very dramatically in the last year or two. And so again, to say those are more a proxy indicator of what potentially is going on, but the statistics are fairly dramatic. Around the world, we are focusing very much on the issue of targeted killings. And our thinking around that is to collect data on the targeted killing of people by criminal groups or actors is a key indicator to measure violence emanating from criminal markets. And what's the position for South Africa? There's a commercialization of targeted killing, so the rise of payment for killing. It's a key mafia attribute. penetrating both the licit and the illicit economy. It's highly symbolic. Everybody in this room knows, reading about hits, whether they take place in fancy areas or poorer areas, and so it undermines trust in the state. And it was in the body politic, so seeping into politics, largely at local government and regional and provincial level. And it is drawn from reservoirs of violence. I've already mentioned some of those. We spend as much time as we can working on our own hits data, and you can see the upswing again from the inflection point here, peaking in 2018 and then peaking again in 2021. The dark blue is the taxi industry, organized crime is the red, political hits are the orange band. To say, again, this is a proxy. We don't claim to pick up all cases, but we try very hard to pick up as many as we can, and we eliminate a lot where we don't have enough information. Of the 1,000 cases that we have, a large proportion, 890, of course, carried out with firearms. Moving into the final markets, critical infrastructure. This it's spelled correctly on the screen. Sorry, we have had a spelling dispute just before I began talking. Railways, electrical supply, communication networks, fuel and oil pipelines, and water infrastructure, highly organized and based on economic incentives, integration with other forms of violence. I won't go through the details, they are in the report. The cost is huge, disrupted services, undermining of trust in the state, again, and linked to violence, and the cost estimates are on the screen. Organized corruption undermines the ability of the state to respond, and we are particularly worried, I have to say, in our field work, about the expansion of corruption in local level law enforcement. We think that's been primarily driven by the drug economy, but not only, and that the position has become extreme. That the front end of local law enforcement has become corrupted in the South African context. That includes other criminal justice institutions, but this is a key challenge. And that undermines the trust in state institutions and the police. Final market, cybercrime. Interpol, between January 2020 and February 2021, noted that South Africa had the highest number of threat detections in Africa. Perhaps that's not surprising given our own computer infrastructure, but mentions of South Africa on the dark web have increased since 2016. And I think the conclusion of the assessment is that there's a much higher awareness of the country's cyber landscape and potential. And just to illustrate that, I think people often stereotype Nigeria as the platform for cyber type activities. This is the location of IP senders of digital extortion schemes in Africa in a couple of month period last year, and South Africa and Morocco are at the top of the scale. That does not necessarily mean those are South Africans, but it shows the extent to which South Africa dominates the African market. We think cybercrime is a key area, or needs to be a key area of focus, and of course the state is responding, but the key issue, I think, is bullet 3. A lack of skills within the state to be able to investigate and prosecute and to make use of the new legislation. And this is clearly an all-of-society challenge. Now, I haven't covered all of the markets, but I've been trying to create a narrative which shows that a number of markets are key in terms of our response, and I want to move towards making several high-level conclusions and then some comments about how the country might be able to respond based on our experience. First point is we think that this is an existential threat. And that's the key conclusion that emerges from the assessment. That criminal ecosystems that lock into and reinforce each other are almost all increasing in scope and scale. And taken together, they pose this threat that I've outlined to our democracy. And organized crime and criminal ecosystems are eroding the trust of ordinary citizens in the state. And if you saw the rather dramatic results from the Social Research Foundation's survey of South Africans, that 82% of South Africans think the state is not doing well in responding to crime. That's a very dramatic figure, 82%. So the sense that in the recent past, the erosion of the state, the criminalization of the front end of the law enforcement system has provided opportunities for criminal governance. And that's why we think extortion is a key challenge. It's a reflection of that process. Two key conclusions. Overlays in politics and organized crime and protection by criminal justice actors has become very significant, both at the top of the system, state capture as is referred to, and cash economies. I've talked about the drug cash economy, have led to severe corruption of the police. When we presented this to the police, I think they acknowledge this, but they want to point out that there's also corruption in other departments, home affairs, prosecution, etc., etc. And that it's difficult to quantify. But the reality is that this is a key trend that has developed. Second point, not all organized crime is violent, but South Africa has a high level of violence and a particularly high level of violence connected to organized crime. I think South Africans would point to a place like Mexico and say that's a very violent place linked to organized crime. Mexico's homicide rate is 29 or 30 per 100,000. South Africa is 40 per 100,000. So we need to understand where we sit in the global hierarchy of levels of criminal markets and their connection to violence. The linkage between ecosystems, violence, and organized crime is a key conclusion of the report, needs to be made. And we need to attack these illicit markets if we are to reduce some categories, not all, but some categories of violence in the country. Now, what has the state response been to date? And I'm not being deliberately critical of state officials, many working very hard, but we need a new strategic approach. Firstly, it's too stovepiped. It takes place in separate areas without a coordinated strategy. It's too reactive, so the responses are often fire forced to individual incidents. It's too random and dispersed. It's not strategic or future-oriented. It often undermines rather than builds trust, and implementation is poor and difficult to measure. So, what is the way forward, as we see it in our assessment, to debate with the broader South African community? Firstly, that this is a collective action problem. It's not a law enforcement problem, it's a collective action problem. And we need to see it like that from the beginning. And we need a whole of government and a whole of society approach if we are to succeed. We need regulatory, communication, enforcement, and other responses. And we need to draw on the great strength of South Africa, which makes us resilient, which is civil society and a broader set of actors in alignment with the state. And unless we do that, we won't win. And I think that's an important point to make. We think that violence and dealing with mafia-style groups, I've labeled and talked around them, is absolutely key. I've mentioned them many times: gangs, taxi, protection groups, mining groups. And in all cases, what happens, not only in South Africa, is these groups fester. People know they are there. They are often in excluded communities. They fester until there's a big incident of violence. And then everybody throws up their arms and says, how did that happen? And then there's a reaction to that. But we need a community, we need a proactive thinking response to reduce violence from those markets before they occur. That means reducing firearm access to mafia-style groups, proactively targeting leaders, literally targeting leaders for enforcement, targeting supply chains, using a regulatory response when you can, and prevent and stem the recruitment of people into those groups. And I'll say more about that. I think it's a very, very difficult area. Bring those groups, if you can, into the formal economy. You cannot arrest your way out of this problem. And I think that's an important part of responding to the challenge. We also need new ecosystems data. I've already made the point that we need new data around current crime statistics, including the disaggregation of our homicide data. Until we understand how much homicide is linked to different illicit markets, we will not know exactly where we can target. And so that's, I'm not saying an easy win, but something that I think would be useful. We need a discussion around regulatory and enforcement drivers and a recognition of market connections. And we need better cross-departmental analytical capacity, mixing with information and research from South Africa's active civil society and academic sector. And we need a thinking response to this, I think, is the point. And that effectively means a whole of society response. So in conclusion, while we are not prescriptive about what South Africa should do, Generally, responses to illicit markets have 4 big components. Number 1, enforcement, highly skilled, resourced, independent. Prevention, a focus on a range of preventative activities, in particular, that keeps a particular categories of people out of illicit markets, often young men. The collection of data, so that we can monitor and measure what we are doing. And finally, a real discussion around whether or not some forms of people engaged in illicit activities can be integrated back into the mainstream of society. That's often a political or an economic choice, and it often occurs when the state is weak. Negotiating with gangsters is the most obvious. All 4 of these elements are the key strategic response, or the elements of the key strategic response to organized crime and illicit markets. And we look forward to the discussion, and it's been a huge privilege to present to you this morning. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Mark. I must say your timing is impeccable. Thank you very much for that. I didn't even have to give you a time warning. I think that a few things have come out from this presentation, not a few, many. There's a lot to think about, and there's a lot to contemplate about the harms that are being caused and the strategic response that is required in terms of these harms and the real existential threat that we are facing. And I think unity and purpose would be very helpful, as you mentioned, the role of civil society and the resilience of South Africa. Even though we're only number 41 out of 193 countries, we are still quite resilient compared to the level that we are at in terms of organized crime. So I'm handing over to the panel now. Professor Sandy, Advocate Vusi, and Ottilia to address some of the issues from this presentation.
So, good morning, everybody. Nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation to say a few words about this report, which has been very well presented. I'm one of those who had the privilege of receiving a copy, so I've had some time, about a week, to try to digest it, but it's an extremely dense report, and I think I'll have to read it over and over again to really, to internalize it. But thank you for the confidence and the opportunity. Happy to see, and in fact a little intimidated to see so many people who are at the coalface of dealing with this huge problem that our society faces. Happy to see some colleagues from University of Pretoria and other institutions. I feel a little at ease. So I've been given 10 minutes to make a few remarks about the report. And what I was going to do, as we tend to do in academia, is try to do a kind of summary and a recap, but I'm not going to do that because it just has been so well presented. But I will say this, and I find that it's really pleasing, really a good example to those who are in state structures, and I have worked in state structures for a long time before taking up a career in academia, to really be transparent about the basis on which the institutions are responding. And I know that in the security sector, there has for a long time been a debate and a call, in fact, for there to be more transparency, greater disclosure about the estimates on the basis of which decisions are taken. For example, the call for at least a declassified version of the national intelligence estimate. And in a sense, this is a kind of declassified version of what is out there and the magnitude of a threat on just one level. No names are named, or at least none that haven't appeared before a court, and yet it's possible to get a very graphic picture. So for those of you who have any influence out there with the ministers and the policy makers and the DGs and whoever else makes these decisions, just do, I think, reiterate the call that we really do need much more transparency when it comes to the sharing of information at a strategic level. So what I want to share with you is how I read this report, this very dense report. You know, I asked myself, what is it telling us about our society? You know, where does organized crime fit in? How does it compare to where we've been? How did we actually get here? And where are we heading? And when I looked at the report, I saw a number of trends. One, some continuity, as you've pointed out, some change, and maybe something very, very new. And I think it's, to me, the report said that we're at the precipice of something that if we actually don't arrest, we are in for a very, very difficult road ahead. So the continuity that I read was that, you know, the levels and form of insecurity caused by organized crime today are in some respects similar to what was at play at the dawn of our democracy, or 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. So the illicit drugs and the, you know, there are just so many markets that have been around. Maybe the quantum has changed. And the fact that the quantum has changed seems to suggest that we've missed opportunities to arrest the spread. But the second trend that I've seen when I read the report is that of change and the emergence of new forms of organized crime. And these have arisen because of the conditions or the opportunities that have allowed them to take hold. For example, I don't know that maybe it was there, but you know, this growth of the construction mafia in the organized way that it actually has penetrated the state, the hijacking of buildings, kidnapping for ransom. I suppose it was there, but I don't know that it was there as a kind of organized form in the way it is. And then corruption in new sectors like the health sector, I suppose it was there, but perhaps not at this level. So this change and continuity, I suppose, are things that stood out for me when I read the report. But there may well be yet another trend, and that is a trend that may define our democracy for years to come. And that is of the state itself being weaponized or used to function as a criminal enterprise. Now this, as I think we've heard, doesn't suggest that the whole of the state has become or turned into a criminal enterprise, but it does point to significant levers of state capacity being turned into instruments at the disposal of criminal enterprises, and where there's pushback against this, signs of those who resist being dealt with quite decisively through violence. So this criminalization of the state through the penetration of institutions by criminal elements has been hugely disruptive and carried out with extreme stealth. So when I read the indicators of, the features of organized crime and how it presents a complex existential threat, and the report describes these, and you'll see it as connected, diverse, embedded, entrepreneurial, violent. I also wondered whether we should not add secretive as yet another element, another dominant feature, because I think if we realize that we're dealing with secret actors, some of them secret in plain sight though. This does suggest that we will need particular strategies for dealing with them. And I also want to hasten to add that the other feature is of resilience, because whilst you do say, Mark, that the state, the society is resilient, I do think that these actors and agents are themselves very resilient, very adaptive, and they're growing. So it's almost as though there's a match to be contended with here. So back to this criminal political complex, which one can define as a network of actors inside and outside of the state to enable, facilitate, exploit for gain opportunities, or exercise unfair advantage in economic activity in the public and private sectors, using coercive methods and with the protection of state institutions, or through the use of force by state actors or paramilitary groups. I think that there have been some obvious, gains. We see people starting to appear before the courts. We've just received the Zondo Commission reports, the Special Investigation Unit reports, not forgetting the work of investigative journalists. I see some in this room who actually have been very instrumental in actually pointing in the direction where investigators could go, work of civil society organizations. They go some way towards unveiling parts of how this political criminal complex operates. But whether the battle against this complex will be won, I think, is still untested. I think we're only at the very beginning of this journey, and so it's really going to take a very strategic approach to actually rally and do the things in a way that is prioritized, well-resourced, and so onwards. And you'll see in the report for yourself, I mean, I said this is a bold claim. Others have made it before, that we are perhaps sitting with a huge problem in the form of this political criminal complex. But we'll see in the report that there are indicators of why it can be characterized as such, be it from the as you say, the front-end security officers who provide the weapons to abet the violence, they accept the bribes, they aid the illicit activity, the way in which state-owned or part-state-owned sectors provide lucrative opportunities for organized theft, the low and high levels of corruption which take place where political institutions and political actors are very much involved. And indeed, this is perhaps an area for research, whether or not political parties themselves are woefully, consciously engaged in this type of activity. Perhaps those are other areas of the research. So the next thing I asked myself when I read the report is to what extent this illicit economy feeds into the political economy, the overall economy, and what's the balance between the illicit and what's the licit. And I think there's need for some research around that. And I think that we are developing, underdeveloped, as some would say, economy with a formal and an informal, very exclusionary, where some actually only have engagements in this illicit economy as a means of livelihood. So there's the livelihood feature that is also at stake here. So many complex questions about the politics, the economy, the political economy, and how to get out of these by addressing organized crime in a very focused and strategic way. So thank you.
Thanks, Prof. I mean, this is someone who really knows her stuff and has worked on these issues for many years and very effectively. And now I hand over to the advocate who was responsible for public prosecutions and is now a board member of GTOC, Advocate Vusi Pikoli. Is Ottilia...
Advocate Pikoli will speak last as a board member of the GI.
As a board member? Okay. Thank you very much, Ottilia, from Institute for Security Studies.
We thought it remiss that Advocate Pikoli, who has worked on the responses, speak
in the middle, but rather, of course, your experience and focus will then be useful for us. A special thanks to everyone, in particular the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the HSRC, the one for the hard work in producing the report, the other for giving us a space to have this conversation. I'm not going to thank anyone else at this point because I only have 7 minutes. My task is really to underscore much of what has already been said and effectively to highlight or to make bold some key points. Before I do that, I'm going to go through 7 of the top 10 news headlines in respect of crime in South Africa over the past month. 10 hours ago, dominoes begin to fall as the investigative directorate swoops in on SAP's crime intelligence. Next, the crimes in South Africa that have become the norm at a massive cost, massive financial cost. South Africa sex crime, authorities charge 7 over gang rape. A big jump in hijackings in South Africa. These are the hotspot areas and trends to look out for. Next, what do the official crime statistics miss in respect of hijacking in South Africa? Then business robberies on the increase across South Africa. Finally, crime in broad daylight and crowded places, a reality for South Africa. I start there because, Mark, you alluded to the fact that there's so much that is spoken about crime and organized crime within the South African context. So much so that we may become desensitized to the very reality of why these crimes should not occur, and certainly not at the level that leaves South Africa ranking so high across the different crime categories. The report itself is split into the 15 illicit markets, and they are split into 3 categories. So Mark, first, again, thank you, because you make my job so much easier. I'm going to speak to some of these through those 3 broad categories. And then I'm going to speak to one connection, and then response, perhaps with a question mark. Again, now I only have 5 minutes to do this. So it's going to feel a bit like we're running a marathon, but much faster. So first, on selling the illicit, these are really categories of trafficking and smuggling, of people, of goods, of flora and of fauna. What we have seen, and from what Mark has presented, and what I believe a lot of people in this room, both in person and virtual, speaks to, is the fact that the idea of selling the illicit within the South African context, again, is perhaps something that many of us are increasingly desensitized of. The idea that we would perhaps put in the same basket the illicit trade in rhino horn with the illicit trade in people and in drugs is something that requires a lot of great focus. For us at the ISS, together with the GI under our ENACT program, this is an area that we really want to increase our focus on, but have already done so for years. The second category is dealing in violence. This is essentially violence for profit. Using violent means to make the most financially. Whether it's robbery, kidnapping, extortion, or other forms of violence, the ultimate aim is economic gain. The third category, preying on critical services. Again, effectively breaking down the state as efficiently or inefficiently as possible. Whether it is denial of service attacks on our ports, whether it is the inability at some point for an institution like the Department of Home Affairs to process applications because they couldn't access their servers. Whether it is illegal mining in areas like Krugersdorp that are also merged in with economies of violence through forms of gang violence. Again, and to my connection, the connection is money. In all of this work, trying to understand why it is people are motivated, whether to sell the illicit, to deal in violence, or to prey on critical services, it's really a huge task for us to actually follow the money. Why is money such an integral connection in this scope? First, we can't ignore the context of grave inequality and poverty that is very readily exploited within the South African context. We simply can't do it. Which brings me then to how do we respond? And this is, Nanya, my last minute and a half. So first, the part we've spoken about, or perhaps before I go into that, if you can work with me here and imagine the way analog clocks rather are supposed to work. If one cog fails, the clock doesn't move. If the minute hand doesn't move, the hour hand stays still. Quite frankly, at the back of your analog clock, you're looking at all the different elements that need to work together to allow time to move. Those are the kinds of responses we're speaking about. The criminal justice system is one of them. Systems of accountability beyond criminal justice response are also integral. This requires upskilling not only of police officers, but also of communities to be able to assist in the detection of these crimes and the response. Collaboration at a multi-sectoral level has to be as organized as the criminals are. It can't be that criminals have greater access across borders within the country than ourselves. We need to turn back the erosion of resilience. At the ISS, through our Violence Prevention Forum, and work towards violence prevention, but also work around parenting policies informed by the fact that the majority of those convicted for violent crime were themselves, quite literally, beaten bad, experienced violence in the home before they experienced it in public. We need to be turning back the tide on the erosion of resilience. Then finally, we need to address, Mark, I know you said you'll work on this, the private sector gap. I'm literally going to end with a full stop here because the chair has given me an extra 20 seconds. She's so generous. But we need to address the private sector gap just as much as we're addressing the gaps in our society, in our criminal justice system, and in the way in which we respond to organized crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Etsilia. As we said earlier, we haven't seen one another for a very long time. It's wonderful to work with the ISS, and we hope to do so, to continue to do so. Thank you for your very insightful comments. You really are quite remarkable, and your timekeeping also spot on. Advocate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was not out of defiance when Ottilia had to come before me, because Peter made sure that Sandy will have 10 minutes, Ottilia will have 7, that I will have 5 minutes. And they've covered everything, actually. Now that we have the report, the risk assessment on organized crime, what do we do? Where to from here? Because it's not meant to be, a report that we just read at leisure. Because the country is in a serious problem, which we've got to admit. That's why we're here. And if this report does not shake us out of our lethargy and denialism, then I don't know what you're about. I just have got a few points that I want to raise. First is that we need an honest conversation around the problem facing us insofar as organized crime and corruption is concerned. And GI has been talking about not us growing, a Chinese wall between organized crime and corruption. We've got UNTOC, we've got UNCAP, and these two have got to work closely together. Therefore, we need to have this honest conversation around these issues. And I must say that the report is quite frank and honest. It might make some of us feel uncomfortable, but that's the truth that we've got to live with. So that we should not be defensive in terms of our failures, but confront our failures head on. Secondly, I think we need professionalization especially in our criminal justice sector. And with the allegiance to our constitution being at the center of the work done by the criminal justice sector. And forget about party politics, partisanship, because it would get the sector nowhere. Thirdly, we once had an effective methodology, and I think we need to go back. Not necessarily perhaps reinstate it as it was because of how times have moved, but it was an effective methodology that we once had. That was, in one way or the other, no matter perhaps how limited it might have been, but it was sort of effective when we had intelligence-driven and prosecution-led investigations. You know? And that methodology was able to deal with both issues of corruption and organized crime under a single command. You know? Where you had, you know, this intelligence, your collectors and analysts, you know, sitting together with the investigators and prosecutors to ensure effective prosecutions. Perhaps we need to have a rethink again around those issues. Another point I want to make is a question of strategic investigations and strategic sequencing of prosecutions. Because we're not going to prosecute every prosecutable crime out there, but we need to be strategic in the sequencing of the prosecutions and make use of our law. I know Mark wants us to go beyond issues of law enforcement, but unfortunately that's the area I know, because I believe that we need to have effective, you know, prosecutions and investigations around these issues. One other point I want to make: how do we deal with state-embedded criminal actors? The number of dockets that have been left lying cold cases up there over the last few years. And some of those responsible for those cold cases are still within the criminal justice sector. How do we deal with that effectively? To make sure that we deal with these matters, you know, in a manner that will make sure that we are able to attain our strategic objectives. So, you know, organized crime, corruption, all these have become embedded in the state, institutionalized. And we've got a challenge. I've got one last minute. Yeah, when it comes to the question of the collective action problem, you know, I would say that let's keep these two going together. The question of prevention, as we had in the National Crime Prevention Strategy, as well as ensuring that we do something now in terms of combating all these issues. Thank you very much.
Well, I think you would all agree with me that that really was an incredible session. Both the presentation as well as the panel's remarks are coming from different perspectives. And I just want to read something that comes out of the introduction of the report before I hand over to you to ask questions to the panel members. South Africa's criminal ecosystem is complex and evolving. It impacts the lives of millions, together with the country's economic health and ultimately its political and democratic integrity too. The poor suffer the most. The state's law enforcement responses to date have failed to check the expansion and evolution of organized crime, even though it is our collective business. Advocate Bokoli has clearly stated that law enforcement agencies have been compromised, as well as state security. But it is not an insurmountable problem. And I think that's where I leave it, because we have heard that there are some solutions, but it's going to take a concerted effort on our part to deal with that. So we have a little bit more time in the venue than we had originally. So Peter, I hope that you're happy that we can continue until 12:30. If there are many questions, and we have, so we'll continue to 12:30. I'll now have to time keep myself. If I lose track of time, please just tell me when it's 12:30. So if you have any questions, I'll take 3 at a time. You can either ask a general question or ask one to a specific panel member. Raise your hand high, and I have my first hand over there at the back, and then one here in the front. Many questions. The gentleman right at the back, and then I'll come to this row over here. You will get your chance. Please keep your questions succinct, because the speakers had to speak for a very short period of time, so you can't speak for 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
I'm Jasper from ProMan Ops. We have been in this industry since 2015, and I think you all know that we have been in the newspaper quite a lot. If I may direct it to the last 2 speakers, and basically to the panel itself in total, we have mentioned that we need to look at a way forward. We have currently a situation in Roslyn about automotive, 50 billion rand project, which is actually a high project, which is a 500 million rand project. We have incorporated quite a lot of the governance partnerships into the project to address a syndicate that has hijacked the project. So we had the words being used, effective methodology, effective everything, professionals and all that. But in our experience that we have had now, I myself, with late Brigadier Modise, created the first illicit business for the police, of which we started to have recorded 450 cases per month of various of these crimes. Currently, in this province, now suddenly it's 0, which I can give you an answer to when you ask me to. But our answer to this is that, what is the answer to resolve all these crimes? It is an enforcement of accountability. Because what we have found is that what relates to the problems is not to try and reset everything. Because there's only one rule, it's the rule of law. The law is already in existence, but police officials and officials of officers, various officers, are avoiding the law. They are avoiding their accountability to the law. So when we can have an enforcement, can we have that? Is there a structure there? Is there anyone from the panel that can say to us, is there an enforcement of accountability?
Thank you. I'm sure the panel's got it. Yes, sir.
I have a question to Mark Shaw. Mark, longitudinally, you presented a sort of development of crime, murder in particular, and you identified 2 inflection points. One is 2011, the other is 2021, with this dramatic rise. Is there any significance in those moments, do you think? Can you help us understand those inflection points?
Okay, I'm sure you've noted the question. And the gentleman at the back on the side.
Hi, Rich Poplak from Daily Maverick. I'm going to be a bit of a pig. I'm going to ask 2 questions related to Ivor's question. Have you identified any relationship between the uptick in organized crime in 2021 and some of the COVID-19 policies that were instituted by the government at the time? The second question is that it appears that you've looked at a lot of the sexy stuff in terms of organized crime, heroin, firearms, etc. Have you looked at more anodyne areas like apparel? According to the OECD, prior to the COVID pandemic, there was $550 billion of illicit counterfeit apparel sales globally during that year. Have you looked at that and how it interrelates with some of the other sectors that you
Thank you. There were two hands, two gentlemen next to one another.
Yes.
Over here, and then the gentleman in red. Yes.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I just wanted to ask a question around resilience and reputation management. And the question is, has the state and has our society lost the psychological war against organised crime already? The second question related is, which state-owned enterprise or state department would Professor Shaw describe as a criminal ecosystem already, at least in part? Let's include names like Eskom, State Security Agency, South African Police Service. Sure. Can you be direct on that?
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Emmanuel from Kali Network Forensics and Security Advisory. My question is based on cybersecurity issues, especially the following: the capacity of the state in terms of dealing with cyber warfare, cyber terrorism, cyber espionage, and cyber extortions. In terms of the ability of the police to respond to these crime sets, including the awareness of the general public in terms of understanding precisely what is it when we talk about cybercrime, the impact of thereof in terms of the economical impact, socio-economical impacts, and then also looking at the political impact of thereof. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. My name is Comrade Trevor Shaku from the South African Federation of Trade Unions. The first question is in relation to the illegal, organized groups in the illegal mining. Is it perhaps possible for the comrades to establish where this gold and other minerals which are mined by these illegal organized groups are sold? Because I do not think they merely mine to throw these things out. There are, of course, people who are buying these minerals from them. The second question is in relation to the professionalization and, of course, the capacity and ability of the criminal justice system to be able to handle some of these crimes. My concern is that we are in a fiscal austerity budget where the number of headcounts in the police and justice system has been cumulatively decreasing over years. Are we going to be able to handle these crimes which are rising in various spheres which Comrade has mentioned there? Secondly, if there is indeed budget cuts in relation to the criminal justice system, are we ever going to be able to put money in training some of these people who are supposed, or personnel which are supposed to be able to handle these crimes? Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to the panel to answer. You can come to the microwave or you can answer from where you're sitting. I think, Mark, you received the most questions, so you can start, and then other panelists can come in order of seating, I think.
Nothing I'm saying, to be clear, is that law enforcement isn't required. I think our experience and our point elsewhere is that law enforcement on its own is not enough, that you need a strategic, as we say, whole of society response. Richard, we could not select all markets, and in fact, you could do this and have 25 markets. Elsewhere in the world, we are working on counterfeits and others, and the sort of political economy of those particular markets. But we thought that we should choose the 15 where we had both the most expertise and were the most obvious as causing damage in the society. That does not mean that markets that are apparently less important don't have the same levels of cost or harm. And on the point, the question I think is important to make the point that not enough discussion is linked to the harm and costing the harm that comes out of illicit markets. I think there's a very big scope of work to do in that area. On COVID-19, this is a very good question. I don't know. I don't know if there's a definitive answer, but I will give the point of view that I have based on we receive from field workers in the Western Cape daily reports. In this period, criminal gangs provided food, water, security, and other things. They expanded into illegal alcohol and cigarettes, and by doing so they built relationships for other trades. It's a classic business model. If you find someone who's going to buy cigarettes, and you keep their number because you can sell them something else. So I think would be some argument to suggest that COVID-19 policies had an impact on the underworld. No, they definitely had an impact on the underworld because they had an impact on all parts of society. Around the world generally, COVID-19, lockdowns, but also economic change and policies led to a growth of illicit markets. So it was not only state policies. Drug trafficking remained incredibly resilient during periods of COVID-19. The delivery systems changed, however, as well as many other models of business. So there's no doubt in my mind, government policy or not, just to answer the question, and I'm not making a political point here at all, COVID-19 changed criminal markets. And it changed criminal markets in South Africa too. And in my view, it allowed, at least, it crystallized the building of criminal governance. And we see that in the extortion economy emerging afterwards. I think that would be the best answer I could give. On the inflection point, again, it's a very good question. And I want to be slightly humble in the response, because I'm not sure. And I think, like all inflection points, it's not just one thing. It's an accumulation of the political, of institutional breakdown, and a range of other issues. And very important about an inflection point is we didn't know it was an inflection point at the time. Like most inflection points, you only see that historically when you look at the data. And so it's very difficult, I think, to track any single reason. But something must have been happening in the system around which violent crime started to track up. And things could have changed and it would have tracked down, and I would have shown this graph and we would have ignored it altogether. But it didn't happen. And so that inflection point becomes almost in retrospect an inflection point. And so I think we could have a debate around the combination of causes that leads to that, that led to it. On the question, have we lost the state? I think this is an important question. Is it too late? I think that's what I read from that question. I don't think it is. And that's honestly an honest response. We have the capacity as a society and the institutions, badly eroded as they may be, if we can have a proper conversation around what we can do. And that's the point of the assessment. Why else would, if we wouldn't do the assessment if it was worthless? The assessment is based on the assumption that we know enough to be able to turn this around. The point is the political will and building the correct institutional and cooperative frameworks to be able to do this, and recognizing that it's a whole of society approach. And if there's a stark message coming from the report, this is an existential crisis for our society, but literally for our democratic systems. And so the importance of doing that and being led around political decisions, and the role of civil society in pushing forward that discussion in line with the discussion around responding to corruption. And as Lucy said, these things are closely interlinked. I agree on cybersecurity. In our discussions with, we have been presenting the report to various constituencies. People have pointed out that the growth of AI will accelerate this dramatically, potentially. Natia Brown, who worked for us on the cyber chapter, is here, and I think cyber, not only in South Africa, but everywhere, is an enormous challenge. On which government department is an ecosystem of corruption, etc. You know, dealing with state actors over the last couple of days and in other countries, I think it is true there are ecosystems of crime and corruption within government departments. It's absolutely true, the report says this. But I think we also need to say that there are people struggling in those departments against those ecosystems in unbelievably difficult conditions. Demotivated, threatened, making choices every day that you wouldn't want to make. And we've got to protect those people within the institutions to turn this around. And it raises very important questions. A question which I think is key to the response is, do you dismantle institutions, crime intelligence, and build new ones with all the dangers that imposes? Or do you try and reform? And I think these are some of the key policy questions that we face. On illegal mining, so I agree. I think the report says it very clearly. There's a section on illegal mining. This is an ecosystem. There are people buying, there are mines, there are smelters, etc. The state needs to understand that chain and act. And as in all criminal markets, people at the bottom, the front end, are often those that are arrested. And at the back end, there are people making money. And law enforcement is a requirement to look at the ecosystem as a whole. Thanks.
Before I hand over to the panelists, just something interesting from the HSRC's research in respect of the inflection point. I'm not saying that this is definitive, but the South African Social Attitude Survey been conducted since 2003. And we have longitudinal data, and we've seen that from 2009, 2011, there has been a remarked decline in trust in government, trust in democracy, and trust in institutions. So that might have something to do with it. Any other panel members wish to answer questions?
Just one.
Yes?
I think Mark has covered almost all the issues. Perhaps just to respond to Jasper over there in terms of enforcement of accountability, especially within SAPS. Not that other departments are not affected, but there's a culture and then there's a subculture. And the subculture in SAPS is that of the code of silence. Not wanting to break that code of silence, we are not going to have proper accountability within SAPS. If we're not going to do away with solidarity within, especially as it relates to criminal wrongdoing, just to get out of our comfort zones. You know, we have had one national commissioner who was, charged, prosecuted, and convicted. There's no way in which you can say that other police officers didn't know what he was doing. There's no way. More so that he was also the president of Interpol. But because of the subculture, people tend to benefit from the subculture itself. Now we've got a former acting national commissioner who was just arrested yesterday. Why are these things happening? Somebody is keeping quiet. Somebody is benefiting. So those are the issues that we've got, to deal with, if we're to ensure that, crime does not threaten our democracy. Thank you.
Do I have to use the mic?
No, you've got a loud enough voice.
Thank you. Saving the HSRC time. Just a couple of points. So first, quite literally, as Advocate Pikoni was coming off the stage, the news of the SIU getting being granted the order to freeze the pension benefits of the former National Lotteries Commission Chief Operating Officer Philemon Letwaba came in, basically. So it's news that has just happened now. I start there in my response to some of the questions, and perhaps to, again, by way of footnote and making bold that yes, institutions are struggling. The fact that, in particular through the research, but also the report, it shows that we still have a great amount of resilience within those institutions and within society helps. And news such as this, including, of course, yesterday's late night news around the SAPS crime intelligence arrests and all of that, it speaks to the fact that within these institutions, at the very least, there are individuals that are committed to doing something. But, and this is the point that Mark made in his presentation, criminal justice response is just part of the accountability basket. When we speak about accountability, it's not just about getting people in orange overalls, because quite frankly, it's just not going to happen if we're being very blunt. Being able to arrest every single criminal in the hope that if they serve time in a correctional services facility for 5, 10, 15, depending on what you're convicted for, years, that you'll come out of that a better person is asking a bit much. The levers of accountability, what ensures the rule of law, to address your comment, the rule of law is not only about the rule by law, or even in law, but it is about recognizing that individuals, law-abiding citizens, recognize that the law will take its course. If people don't do that, if people lose trust, HSRC studies have shown this, then we've got a problem. So building that confidence, societal confidence, and the ability to respond is effective. Why is it that we are seeing community vigilante groups sprouting up? It's precisely to fill a gap that exists in terms of ensuring accountability. And we, and I say we because it's not just about people working within SAPS or people working within the NPA to ensure accountability. It is a whole of society take. And then in terms of not just focusing on sexy crimes, I'm not sure what crime is sexy, but I will say that at least in terms of the work that we are doing under the program on enhancing Africa's response to organized crime, in which the GI as well as Interpol are partners, our regular analysis speaks to a range of other crimes. So a report can only do so much. So this is not an ad, but it is an ad to really look at enact analysis. It includes, illegal fishing, for example. It includes the illegal trade in birds, but it also includes those crimes that people don't necessarily think are so big. And when we speak about the heroin coast, and Mark spoke to this quite poignantly, but when we speak about the heroin coast, we're also speaking about people using drugs such as wonga, which is a mix that includes opioids. So we're not just speaking about the stereotypical view around heroin as this drug over there. We're actually speaking about the use of tick. We're speaking about the use of wonga within communities that lends itself to that. And then the final point, Nanya, for me, relates to the question around cybercrime. And thank you for posing that question. This is, I spoke earlier about being ahead of criminals who are more organized than us. The cyberspace space, as you know, is one of the fastest growing spaces and one of the largest unregulated spaces out there, quite frankly, which means law enforcement is almost always going to be playing a game of catch-up. It's why I said the private sector gap is in both ways. It is on the criminality side, but it is also in effective responses, because they are literally people whose job it is to understand the cyberspace that are in the private sector that aren't always tapped into. SABRIC as an institution exists to attempt to address this. There is, obviously, with the new act, efforts to ensure that we are able to use the law to respond to threats to cybersecurity and cybercrime. But, and this goes to awareness in the public, when you ask an ordinary person their take on what cybercrime is, most of it relates to your SMS-generated loss of funds. Most of it are relating to phishing scams, for example. They're not thinking about the bigger infrastructural picture, so to speak. And to end, Nanya, when there was a denial of service attack on the ports in KwaZulu-Natal, which is a major entry point for South Africa, that is, for me, a crime against the state. The fact that we are unable to receive and process goods And the fact that we're unable to identify the perpetrators because they could be in Hungary or Australia by way of using VPNs to evade justice, that is something that we need to be looking into. Public awareness, but also state awareness. Chair, I'm sorry for speaking a bit longer than I thought I would.
No problem. Sandy?
I don't have a big voice. Okay, thank you. Just a quick response to the question from the comrade from Saftu about illegal mining and where who's buying all this stuff. In fact, the report doesn't really cover who's buying anything. I think it's just a snapshot of what's happening, what are the kind of not even so much what are the transaction, but what are the sectors where this stuff is happening. But I had to go into some of your other stuff to just make sense and do my contextual reading, and two things stood out, and one is that other reports do address that, but I do think that perhaps the analyses that you do, if you're going to be doing these strategic assessments on a regular basis, and it would be good to do another such major study in another 5 years and another 10 years and so on. We should cover that. So unfortunately, I don't have the answer to the question. But I think it's an important question, especially when you read the anecdotal evidence and reports about how sometimes, it's not just small actors who are involved. They are literally kind of underground multinationals who are at play here. And so I raise this question because we often tend to see organized crime in a way as marginal and not indeed in a way quite fundamental to the way in which economies operate. And that's the point I was trying to make about the illicit and the illicit, how much of our economy is illicit. There's a lot of things that are not declared. We know that. Even in the regular economy, there's a level of kind of flying, not declaring illicit offshore, a whole offshore economy. And I think that it's actually a pity that we actually don't have the full sense of that. So I do think that researchers and civil society organizations and indeed state institutions really need to be looking at whether our economy is as clean as we sometimes like to think it is. But the other point I want to make, and that is because of reading the GTOC documents, is something that they call a developmental approach to organized crime, which does what I think Otelia was saying, and that is you don't only look at how the security response, but the social response, so the economic response, the political response. And I think a lot of work needs to go into that sector. So I do hope that you're engaging with social development and education and communications and all the other actors who also have a role to play in addressing the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those very complete responses to the questions. I hope that you feel that your question has been responded to, but I'm sure you can also approach a panelist afterwards. Any more questions? We have time for 3. There's one hand at the back there, in the middle, and over here.
Hi there. Thank you so much. My name is Diana Neal. I'm from the you really answered my question in part. I guess what I'm curious about is in mapping these illicit markets, the sense of how these tap into a formalized economy, or informal economy, I suppose, and effectively the size and the scope of that economy and how formalized it can become. And there are kind of traits or comparisons that can be made with the formal economy. And then, Mr. Shaw, to your point earlier, you were alluding to COVID-19 organized crime factions who were, as you said, kind of almost providing services to communities. Is there anything in the scope of the work that you've been doing that shows how these entities, these mafia-style entities, are effectively taking over whole kind of swathes of places, geographical locations, and actually creating new societies, if you will, in terms of how they co-opt ordinary citizens into an illicit economy or illicit market and provide services in return?
Okay, sir?
Thank you very much for the presentation to panel. Oh, it's David. Okay, I'm standing from the, we didn't hear that voice, what you call it, the victims of the organized crime. Yeah, I believe there had to be some victims eventually, or is it, yeah, okay, yeah, then we like also to ask, I think, the victims, okay, I've been a victim of, I think it's organized crime, yeah, it's 10 months, or I got dropped in UP, Residency South Street, they stole my iPhone, or was I language from China, Asia, sometime. Police station. Okay, yeah, also we need to also question these issues of what you call them, the white collar crimes. The white collar crimes, they call them. We had incidences, and I'm still chasing, please catch up with me, I'm still catching up the current status quo of crime activities, actions in the country, overseas sometimes. We saw insurance collusion with the insurance collusion companies sometime. So we also saw the banks collusions, also the foreign currency stuff. So did we also look into that? The ones who are most affected the most, the current state of the matters. Okay, we would also like to ask, we didn't
just one more, please.
Invited to do, is it organized crime? Was it? Yeah, the foreigners also extortion of foreign nationals, especially students. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, the gentleman on my right.
Was it me?
Yes. As far as I recall.
Okay. Hi. Okay. So my name's David Bruce. I'm just going to make a quick observation and then a question, which is, I just think that the kind of economic dimension of this whole issue. When in your presentation you talked about this issue of inclusion and to what degree there are opportunities for bringing people in these kind of economies into a non-illicit economy and so on. I think that's just a profoundly important and perhaps should be foregrounded as the central aspect of this question. But nevertheless, I'm going to focus my question on in some ways, perhaps the easier issues to talk about, which are the criminal justice responses to this. And so, one of the debates at the moment is about restructuring investigation agencies, specifically related to the investigation of corruption. Now, I must say that I have a personal aversion to the idea of restructuring agencies because I think it potentially destabilizes agencies. I think we need to strengthen agencies. But nevertheless, without trying to influence the answers that I get from anyone on the panel, do you have thoughts about what this analysis of yours related to organized crime says to us about maybe staying away from specifically intelligence agencies at the moment, but specifically in terms of investigation agencies? Do we need to restructure them? What do we need to do to them in order to have a response which is effective in engaging with the complexity of this problem?
Thank you. I don't think we have time for more questions, but you're welcome again to engage with the panel, except I'm going to be mischievous and ask a very quick question. So, where there is an overlap between organized crime and corruption, is there an effort to destabilize the state?
Well, that's a bit easier, I think, because then I just answer one or two and then leave it to the rest. So first, around this question you posed on victims of organized crime, make no mistake that when we talk about organized crime, we're not speaking of this form of criminality as a victimless crime. I stressed, and Mark did likewise in the presentation, the varying ways or forms that organized crime takes. Of course, we've selected some and not all, but you've got to recognize that when we speak about trafficking and smuggling of people, people are the victims and targets in that particular space. When I speak about violence for profit, whether it is a robbery, a kidnapping, extortion, or other forms of violence, the people that are impacted, again, are indeed people. When we speak about preying on critical services, if, for example, your crime results in the lack of personal protective equipment, for example, the people are the ones that suffer as a result, both from lack of access to those resources, but importantly, because we then funnel what could be useful state funds, and this responds to the question on inclusion, what could be useful state funds are then funneled towards responding to crime. We could be using a lot of that money towards actually leveling the playing field as far as inequality is concerned, but we're investing a lot, and we need to responding to these crimes. When you speak also about white-collar crimes or collusion and corruption, there's a long history of collusion and corruption that predates democracy as a means to actually make whatever ends meet, so to speak. The result, and I'll stress this point again, whether it's bread cartels, whether it's cement cartels, whether it's cartels in the transport industry, the result, whether it's price fixing, price gouging, the people that are impacted invariably are the poorest in this society. And we cannot ignore that. We cannot pretend as if white-collar crime only has white-collar victims, when the reality is longer, deeper stems in the way in which it impacts. And then the final one from me around the restructuring of investigation agencies. David, I recognize that you're sitting a step away from Gareth, who I'm sure over lunch can speak to you in great depth around this. So without speaking out of turn on that particular point, our colleagues in the Justice and Violence Prevention Program of the ISS do amazing work in engaging with the police, in engaging with the National Prosecuting Authority and agencies with a vision to build, with a vision to ensure that those institutions don't decay, but actually are able to be sustained. Should they be restructured? Personally, I would say no. What I would say is there needs to be a proper analysis across the institutions to look at what's working well, what's failing, what are the ways in which we can be able to strengthen them. What I will caution against is the creation of additional structures because the ones we have are failing, without the removal of those failing ones, because all that means is a big bill. And I'll go again, the more money we spend, the less is available for those that need it the most.
I'll try to be brief. Well, GI could have gone beyond the 15 illicit markets, but chose to restrict itself to only 15 illicit markets for purposes of ensuring that at least we're able to take this report that is quite exhaustive on those issues. Question of victims, we're all victims of organized crime and corruption. We're all victims. No one is spared in this. Then on the question raised by David Bruce over there, well, previously there was some attempts made with varying degrees of success, especially on intelligence services. There was a ministerial, inquiry on civilian intelligence. It had its own perhaps results. There was one on defense intelligence, also produced mixed results. But funny enough, on crime intelligence, never, ever And that's where we have the biggest of our problems. Perhaps we seriously then need to look at, how crime intelligence is currently structured and who is in crime intelligence. We need to look at that very seriously. Yes.
I'll be brief. Just thank you for the questions. Diana, to start on yours, the difference between the illegal sector and the legal sector is often systems of trust and regulation. So I think, and you can see this very much in some of the conclusions we draw. Markets that are not well regulated often seek to regulate themselves with violence. The taxi industry is a very good example of that. State regulation fails, violence grows into the DNA of that economy. It's an illicit economy, and it seeks to regulate itself because there's not trust built around the process, partly because state efforts over many years have not necessarily been successful. And I think that says something around the solutions. Markets are generated when regulation fails, not necessarily enforcement in some cases. And violence and hits and the commercialization of the assassinations economy, in my view, is an outcome. It's a system of violent regulation. On places that become criminally governed, I think there are many examples in South Africa. Not only in South Africa, and the point is a simple one. There's often a symbiosis between state agencies and the form of governance, so the corruption of local policing in particular, the front end of the state, the emergence of key, let's call them bosses, the provision of basic services beginning with security and a range of others, and an exchange of favors with people within those communities. You can look in many places where that is occurring. So fundamentally it's about not necessarily the withdrawal of the state in that the police station doesn't close, but the compromising of the state and the symbiosis between state actors and other emerging forms of, let's call it, criminal power. And I think that's a key characteristic, not only here, in rapidly urbanizing places, but also in rural areas and elsewhere. The one point I want to make from, I think, the University of Pretoria colleague, on extortion, just a very quick point. Extortion often begins targeting the most vulnerable who won't report. So it's no accident that extortion starts with Pakistani shopkeepers, but extortion grows. So the model of extortion is almost always starting within vulnerable communities and spreading, and South Africa has followed and is following that model. And extortion is extremely difficult to break because nobody reports, and it's easier not to report. So again, to highlight the issue around extortion being a key issue. Inclusion, David, we agree, but we have had a lot of discussions around this. But just to give an example, the construction mafia, and there's been a very interesting debate in News 24 around, do you draw in the construction mafia or do you enforce, etc.? This is a classic inclusion discussion. And I'm not going to say what is right or wrong. My view fundamentally tends more towards the enforcement side while providing incentives for inclusion in some way. But I think this goes to the heart of the broader set of policy questions that we are talking about. And it raises very important points, for example, in gang-ridden areas, the Western Cape. How do you bring people in? And you simply can't do that with enforcement alone. I won't make a comment on alternative institutions, but to make, I think, one key comment above the issue of the institutions. South Africa is not prioritizing organized crime. We are simply not prioritizing it in our law enforcement institutions. We are not putting the law enforcement resources, strategy, and thinking behind this, whichever institutions we have, and that, I think, is the place to start.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end. There's 5 minutes left. And that's just for me to say that the HSRC is very honored to be able to have hosted this event and the launch of the report by GTOC, to be joined by the University of Pretoria and the Institute for Security Studies. And we truly hope that the conversation will continue, because there is a lot of research that needs to be done still. And I noticed that my question wasn't answered, but we'll deal with that later. Also to let you know that there are copies of the book outside. You may help yourselves, no cost. And there are also snacks and non-alcoholic drinks also at no cost just outside the venue. Thank you very much, everyone.